Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are some of the major challenges when dealing with water, food, energy, and climate? My guest today is an expert who's researched these areas intensively and is going to bring us up to date on some very interesting findings. My guest today is Felix Dodds. Felix Dodds is a UK national, and he is a senior fellow at the Global Research Institute and a senior affiliate at the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina. Also, he is an associate fellow at the TELUS Institute, and he is co-director of the 2018 Nexus Conference on Water, Food, Energy, and Climate. Felix, welcome back to today's Global Connections program.
Happy to be here.
Glad you're back. We did this about 4 years ago, and there's been a lot of development since then. Let's jump right into this and talk a little bit about the sort of wrap all this up together in like the sustainable development. Now, you just last year, I believe, you co-authored a book with the former Irish ambassador, Donahue, who was here at the United Nations. What was the thrust, what was the title of the book, and what was the thrust of it?
Well, the title of the book was Negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, Transformational Agenda in an Insecure World. And the objective of the book with Hermina, who was the third author, was to first to tell the story about how the SDGs came about, why they were different from the Mdgs, and then to, at the end of the book, suggest what the critical issues that the world would have to face in the 15 years that the SDGs were going to be negotiated.
Mm-hmm. Could you just jog my memory a little bit? The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. What was the emphasis of the MDGs versus the SDGs?
So that's a very good question. So the MDGs were predominantly sectorial. The SDGs are meant to try and look at things in a cross-sectoral way, like a nexus. There are many nexuses you can look at, the interlinkages between the goals and targets. The MDGs were about developing countries, and the SDGs were about all countries, so a universal agenda. So clearly a little bit more different than that. The SDGs were different from the MDGs, which dealt with just development, and the SDGs dealt with social, economic, and environmental issues. So they addressed sustainable development as a whole. So the combination of those differences allows us to address what member states felt were the 17 or 16 major issues that were facing the world, and the 17th goal is really a means of implementation goal. So how you then address it through partnerships.
Mm-hmm. And so I think back, let's see, the Millennium Development Goals had 8 goals. That's to correct. Reduce abject poverty by 50%, to empower women, to reverse the AIDS pandemic, that type of thing. And the Sustainable Development Goals now have 17 goals, and some of them are amplifying some of those. I think the first one is to eliminate poverty by 2030, is it not?
Yeah, so clearly the development agenda had to be at the center part of the sustainable development agenda. And in a sense, it's really going back to Brundtland, where there was a first attempt to try and address
Gro Harlem
Brundtland, who came out with the report Our Common Future in 1987, which defined sustainable development and tried to bridge the environment and development in a sense, sectors together. And the original Rio in 1992, then through Agenda 21, 40 chapters, tried to address both the development and the environmental agenda. As we moved through the 90s and 2000s, the lack of implementation of the Agenda 21 commitments meant that by the time we got to the negotiations for Rio plus 20, it was clear we needed a new set of goals that addressed not just development. They addressed the environmental impacts, and they addressed the economic challenges that we were facing. And so due to the leadership, particularly from developing countries, first in having Rio plus 20 as in a sense, a starting point for that conversation, the leadership of Brazil, but the Sustainable Development Goals were an initiative initially put forward by the government of Colombia, and then supported by Peru and Guatemala and the United Arab Emirates. So very much a leadership from developing countries, not from developed countries. And then as we went through the process towards the 2015-2030 agenda being adopted, then the negotiations and the input from civil society, from stakeholders, from member states and the UN system managed to come up with these 17 goals and 169 targets, which to some extent give us a roadmap to how we can make it possible that we might live on this planet in a more sustainable way.
Which we certainly need to do, and we better accelerate very quickly here. I think we're losing ground. Now, you do have a website. It's felixdodds.net. If our viewers would like to go to that and tap into what we're talking about. As you were going through, that was a great chronological explanation of how we've evolved over the past several years. And you were talking about the Agenda 21, which I think came out of the Rio Conference.
That's correct.
UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And that, before we get into the rest of this, that has been a heated topic of debate, especially for some of the right-wing talk show hosts in the United States. So you hear this nonsense, as I put it, about how the Agenda 21 is trying to take over our government, usurp the sovereignty of the United States, put golf courses out of business, that type of thing. And as I recall, the business community was excited about Agenda 21 because it was just basically a list of suggestions on how to be more sustainable. Is that correct? On how to conserve energy, how to really improve your bottom line as far as your profits and that type of thing if you do save money on energy and doing other things.
So, by and large, it was the united knowledge of the world that was put into those 40 chapters. And each of the chapters has a very interesting narrative. It explains what the problem is, it explains what you want to achieve, and then it gives you some policy options that you might address, and then it gives you suggestions on what the means of implementation to deliver those are, whether that's education or capacity building or finance or changing your governance structures. It was predominantly for developing countries. It was the united knowledge of the world at that time to help developing countries to develop sustainably. And Maurice Strong was asked how much would it cost to implement Agenda 21, and he said it would be $625 billion a year, of which they would be expected to be a transfer of $125 billion from developed to developing. And at that point, ODA was about $60 billion. And one of the problems in the 1990s was that instead of increasing development aid to address these challenges and help China and India particularly to develop in a more sustainable way, aid actually fell from 60 billion in 1992 to about 56 billion in 1998, 1999. It only went back up to the same level by 2002 by the Johannesburg summit. And there are reasons for that. After the original Rio, what you had was, just before the original Rio, you had the breakdown of Eastern Europe and the democratization. And so money that had originally been put aside to help implement Agenda 21 got reassigned to help stabilize the democracies of Eastern Europe. You had the first Iraq war, so oil prices went up. And so there were reasons why it wasn't implemented. In a sense, we've now taken till 2015 to come back to a coherent agenda which actually can help us all address the challenges both in developed countries and in developing countries. And so I think that one of the great things about the 2030 agenda and the SDGs is it is about all of us. We all have to change the way we're living on this planet so that others will be able to live here sustainably as we would like to in future generations.
That's extremely important. We've got to we've got to, whether we want to or not. We have no choice.
Yes.
Now, you are presenting a paper tomorrow at the UN on how member states might address the Sustainable Development Goal targets. What will come? What is your major suggestion going to be?
So, in what was a very, I think, rich input to the original setting of these 17 goals and 169 targets. Not all of the targets had a 2030 timeline. 23 of them will actually fall in 2020 or 2025. And so the paper looks at that and makes some suggestions on how you might update those targets. So 10 of them, for example, are in the chapters dealing with oceans and biodiversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity will start its negotiations next year to replace its own targets, which are 2020. So the UN needs to make a decision. Does it want to allow those processes to happen independent of a coherent approach. So you could make a decision that, for example, these targets will fall in 2020 and 2025. You'll carry on measuring them, but you won't update them. But then again, if those targets are updated in other forums, you end up in a potential place where you have two levels of targets, ones which have been endorsed through the SDG process and one which has been endorsed through a different process. And so that needs to be sorted out. And the paper addresses that, gives 5 options by which member states might at least start that discussion in their capitals.
Mm-hmm. And we have to do that. And as we mentioned, though, I think you alluded to it earlier, that the Sustainable Development Goals, the Mdgs, they applied to the developing countries, but the Sustainable Development Goals apply to all of us, all 7.6 billion people on the planet. And so it's in our best interest to learn more about them. And of course, this is all voluntary. It's not being imposed by the United Nations or some supranational entity that's out there, but this is totally voluntary. But they're really commanding and demanding issues such as climate change, which we're going to get into in greater detail in a minute. The one thing, well, let's move on to this. You've got so many great books here. We could do a show on each book. We can sit here and talk about it. But let's talk about your Brookings report, Links in the Chain of Sustainable Finance, Accelerating Private Investments for the SDGs, including Climate Action. What is the thrust of that book?
So that wasn't my book. That was done by the Brookings Institute.
It was done by Brookings.
And I sat on the advisory panel for the President of the General Assembly on that. And the really important thing to remember is that overseas development aid, even if every country gave 0.7% of what they're meant to, and there are only 4 or 5 countries that do that, you'd only be talking about 320 billion. It's been estimated it's going to cost between $3 to $7 trillion a year to implement the SDGs. So clearly, a lot of that's going to come from the private sector. And so then the question is, how can we nudge the private sector in the right direction? And the Brookings report made a number of suggestions, some of which are, in a sense, you'd think are quite easy, but it still takes a lot of persuasion to get member states and institutions to take them up. So one, for example, would be to make it a listing requirement for all companies listed on the stock exchange to have to produce their environment, social and governance reports as they have to produce their economic reports. If they did that, then what you'd have is Bloomberg doing a rating of whether they're good reports or whether they're bad reports. Brazil actually did this in 2012 as 2011 in preparation for Rio +20. South Africa's stock exchange has done it. The Indian stock exchanges have done it. I think there's a couple of others, like I think Malaysia has done it. So if all of the stock exchanges did that, then that would start to have an impact on the supply chain. So companies will be looking at the supply chain and how their suppliers are doing that. And that would start to reorientate companies towards being part of the solution to deliver the SDGs. So that's one of the recommendations that was in the report, and what we would hope would be part of a General Assembly resolution next year. Another would be to get the credit rating agencies to, once that's in place, to then include that in their rating system for companies on whether those companies are good value. And so those are the kinds of things that we would look at in that context.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you have an interest in our programs and would like to share them, please do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at 4 issues, well, several others, but 4 in particular that impact us every day. We're talking about water, energy, food, and climate. And my guest is an expert on all of these issues. My guest today is Felix Dodds, and Felix Dodds is a senior fellow at the Global Research Institute and a senior affiliate at the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina. Felix, we're talking about undertaking some very ambitious programs to deal with these problems.
Yes.
And of course, the private sector is so critical. The public sector can do so much, but you really have to have the private sector, and it seems they're getting more involved in this whole issue, especially of climate change. But do you see that in your areas that companies that maybe 10 years ago never thought about it, 15, 20 years ago wouldn't even talk to you about it, but they're getting more involved today?
I think that's true, and I think that you're seeing it as a risk, and it comes out at the top of the World Economic Forum's risk table. It's either number 1, number 2, or number 3, and so clearly that is a critical issue, and that companies are starting to fit it into their work programs. The other thing I would mention is that at the Heads of State meeting in September this year, they launched a thing called the World Benchmarking Alliance, and that was a group of organizations, including the UN Foundation, but also the insurance and pension company Aviva. And what they're doing is they are benchmarking companies around the different SDGs. And they think that once the companies are linked on a league table, you'll be able to say to these companies, well, why aren't you doing more? And it will create some positive opportunities to get companies to do more in the areas of the SDGs.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the opening, I mentioned about water, food, energy, and climate, and you're doing in 2018 a Nexus Conference focusing on these. What is the Nexus Conference first, and what are you going to be talking about, and what do you think some of the recommendations are going to be as to how we deal with these challenges?
So the conversation around the Nexus is in some ways not new. It's the issue about that you shouldn't look through sectorial lenses at everything. And that conversation happened every year at the old Commission on Sustainable Development, but no one really put any energy into it. In 2011, the German government did the first Nexus Conference. And that's to say, look, we need to recognize that water is significant for energy. It's also significant for agriculture. It's also impacted by climate change. And so we need to look at trade-offs between these different sectors, and we need to have a coherent approach to how these resources are using each other. And so clearly, for example, if you're bringing fossil fuels out of the ground, it uses a lot of water, same with nuclear energy. But if you're using solar or you're using wind, it uses very little water. So therefore there's more water for people or for agriculture. If you can reduce your use of water in the crops area, which is for agriculture, 70% of the water we use is used in agriculture. If we can reduce that, we can use it for energy, or we can use it for people, or we can use it for biodiversity. So those are really critical issues. So we did the second conference in 2014, and that inputted to the SDG negotiations and perhaps influenced some of the water targets in making them much more kind of cross-sectoral. The 2018 conference will look at the Nexus through an urban lens, because that's where it really, like the rubber hits the ground. Our opportunities there are to say, well, local authorities, subnational governments, state in the US, really need to look at how they balance these 4 areas and what they can do to have, in a sense, to some extent, a nexus budget of where they're going to use their water, where they're going to use it for energy or for agriculture. So that will be the focus of the conference. The output will feed into 2 things. One is the high-level political forum next year, which will address the goals on energy, water, urban consumption and production, and biodiversity. And it will feed into the Heads of State first review of the SDGs in 2019.
And is it the case that by 2050, something like 75 to 80% of all the people will be living in urban areas? And of course, the urban areas create the biggest carbon footprints, but they are critical as far as solving this carbon problem, or using fossil fuels and also reducing that carbon footprint, are they not?
They are, and that's the kind of conversation we hope will happen at the conference. In fact, the estimation is that by 2030 we'll need an extra 30 or 40% of electricity because of changes in urbanization and changes in the economic development models in China and India. It's estimated that we'll need 30 to 40% more food as well, and that we'll have a shortfall in water of maybe 30%. And that will be not just in developing countries, it will also be in the United States. I live in North Carolina. We've had droughts around Charlotte quite a lot over the last few years. You don't imagine that in North Carolina, but it's happening. And so more and more the US is going to have to address this kind of issue of interlinkage between these sectors.
We've seen that we've had this climate change debate for years now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, created by the United Nations, has come up with some very significant studies, as have many groups around the world. 97% of the climate or scientists believe climate change is happening, that humans create, well, I think 95% of it or something like that. It may be off on that figure. How daunting, even though we do hear a few people saying climate change is not happening or it's cyclical, but it is happening, and we can see it every day. We read about it. Two major glaciers just broke off in Antarctica yesterday, so we see it every day. We read about it. How daunting is this climate change challenge, and what do we need to do to move quicker, and what's going to happen if we don't move quicker?
Well, if we don't move quicker, then we're going to see, according to the models, we're going to see more and more erratic weather patterns, and we've already started to see that. And sometime it becomes so bad that we actually will find it impossible to plan around, and that makes it very difficult for local or subnational governments. And that's again a reason why we want to address it at that level. We think that that's in a sense the front line to all this. We've seen that in Florida, in the Keys, what happened there. We saw it in New Orleans. We saw it in Texas. The opportunity here of creating resilient societies will be one of the critical challenges of this generation. To do that, we need to, in a sense, wean ourselves off carbon. And so the sooner we can do that, the less long-term damage. Already some people would argue that damage is irreversible. Even if it's irreversible, we can try and limit that irreversibility by doing the right things. The quickest, if we can move towards renewables sooner, that will have a big impact. I've bought myself a Tesla.
Oh, did you? Congratulations.
I haven't got it delivered yet, so who knows when that will happen. But you can make lifestyle decisions, or some of us can make lifestyle decisions in living the way that we talk about, and if we're not able to do that, then it makes it very difficult to persuade other people to do that.
Exactly. And informing the public is so critical. You're doing that through your writings, through your involvement at the United Nations and in other fora also. You've also, all this doom and gloom we've been talking about, will end on a lighter note. One thing you're doing is to try to help children better understand this. You just created a comic book, is that correct?
I did it last year with UNICEF. It's part of the Comics
the UN Children's Fund.
Yeah, the site is Comics Uniting Nations, and it's PCI Media and UNICEF partnership, it's done about, I think, 10 now. They've just done one with Marvel and Guardians of the Galaxy. And it's an opportunity for the SDGs to be made much more relevant to children. And in fact, it was originally launched, I think, in October 2015 by the Secretary General at the New York Comic Con. Which I think was a really exciting thing for him to do. And so the comic looks at Santa Claus as an icon, and it looks at how Father Christmas finds out about climate change, and then what he does to change the way he's living his life to make it much more sustainable. And I would hope people would have a look at the comic. It's available on the Comics Uniting Nations website, and share it with other children.
That's the best way to do it, yes. Well, in our last 15 seconds, do you have a parting suggestion for us as to what we need to do to deal with these very difficult problems?
So I think part of it is clearly the getting the message out. The more people know about the SDGs now than the Mdgs in the same time period. You've already seen a lot of the foundations reorganize around funding SDG processes through what's called sdgfunders.org. Many of the NGOs I'm working with, donkey sanctuaries. Who would have imagined that donkey sanctuaries would be making the SDGs their focus? But they are, because donkeys are very important, particularly in disaster relief issues and things like that. And so, it's very much a gender issue. And so, what we're finding is that people are buying into the idea of this roadmap. this 15-year roadmap to 2030. And if we can work together in partnership, we'll achieve the real change we need to.
And we have to do it. Felix Dodds, I want to thank you so very much
Pleasure.
for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.